Aha, my hearties! What sword would I choose if I was a pirate in the Golden Age of Piracy? Well, first up, it wouldn't be this. First up, before we go into this, I mentioned this video is sponsored by War Thunder, but more about them in a bit. So my name's Matt Easton of Scholar Gladiatore channel. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted from approximately 1650 through to about 1730. So we're going to be looking specifically here at the second half of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, which means that this sword is out. This is a Royal Navy cutlass from the 19th century. Bye-bye, cutlass! So that is not an option for this particular selection. So this is a particularly personal thing to me. What would I choose? Now, obviously, this is my personal choice of what would I choose as a pirate in the late 17th, early 18th century, 1650 to 1730. But what would you choose? This is a personal thing. What would you choose? And you can get posting down below with your choices. But there were a vast array of swords used at this time. And before I get into any specific swords, I want to point out, don't only think European here. So you have to bear in mind that pirates, by their very nature, came from lots of different places. There were English pirates operating next to Spanish and Portuguese, next to Caribbean pirates, North African pirates, Southeast Asian pirates, Japanese pirates, Indian pirates. There were pirates from all over. Okay, so we've got pirates in the Caribbean, most famously due to the movies, but we've also got them in the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, all around Africa. So this could include any of the swords that were around at this time. Right, let's leap into this straight away. So I think what most people think of when they think of a pirate sword is a cutlass. Now, I have mentioned in the past that actually cutlasses that look like that one weren't really around yet at this time. What were around? Well, really, forms of what we call falchion or hanger. Now, I've got a couple of later examples here because I don't actually own a 17th century example, but they'll give you a sort of rough idea of what we're talking about. So we're talking about a short-ish sword which has usually at least a knuckle bow, although not always, but usually a knuckle bow, and very often some form of sidebars. Now, these can sometimes be called dussack or dussack as well. Here's a simpler example of a hanger, and this just has a knuckle bow. So some of them just have a little knuckle bow like that. Some of them have side guards or shell guards or things like this. So that is the kind of default sword that people think of. We'll come back to those in a bit. However, there were plenty of other swords around at this time. So if we're talking late 17th, early 18th century, then there is a transitional period at this time between the rapier and the small sword. Now, you might be wondering what's the difference between these two. Well, actually, one comes out of the other, I believe. So the small sword evolves from the rapier. They are both thrust-centric, relatively narrow thrusting swords, worn by gentlemen, worn in court, worn in civilian life, but also carried in military life as well. George Washington wore one, for example, in war, but they were also used by people like the Spanish and the Italians, even in piratical exploits. Now, this particular rapier here, which is probably Southern Italian with Spanish influence, this is a good example of the type of rapier that would have been around at the beginning of the Golden Age of Piracy. And indeed, if you were someone like a captain or an admiral or just, you know, some kind of officer, a gentleman essentially, then this is the sort of sword that, in fact, you may wear in civilian life. But would you wear it if you were being a pirate? And indeed, we could extend that same question to the small sword. Well, I'm going to start up straight from that point and say that I think that certainly small swords, I think, pretty much suck for piratical exploits, and rapiers, I think, are slightly better, but for different reasons. So first up, the rapier has some disadvantages for fighting on board ships or in close actions like this because of its length. Okay, so a long straight thrusting sword which acts in straight lines essentially is not particularly good on board a ship. If you're Errol Flynn, you might be able to get away with it, but the fact is that if you've got lots of rigging and masts and things around you and people using things like boarding pikes and hatchets, we'll come through to those sort of things in a minute, then while you can obviously use this as a weapon and you could make it effective, and if you were good with a rapier, absolutely it would be a good sword for you, it's probably not the best choice. It's not very versatile. It's not very good in a melee against multiple opponents because you can't cut, or at least not cut very effectively with most rapiers, and you can't really cut at all, or barely at all, with small swords. Now, the funny thing is the small sword is shorter. So in that sense, you could say, well, the shorter one is possibly better on board ship, and I'd possibly agree with you, but for one thing, and that is that the rapier is far better in defense because of its much, much more substantial hand protection. Okay, so by and large, I would say that if I personally had to serve on board a ship in the late 17th century, I would rather have a rapier than a small sword, but I don't think either of them are really good choices. Now, we could at that point come to a type of small sword, or what was sometimes known as a shearing sword, later on a spadroon, which is a bit like a small sword but has some cutting capacity, because I've said, you know, one of the problems here is the rapier is not great at cutting, the small sword sucks at cutting, but if we have something that has the length and nimbleness of a small sword, very good at thrusting, but can cut, would that make it better? I would say marginally yes, and that's probably why shearing swords and spadroons were chosen by military officers very often instead of the small sword, because it kind of looked like a small sword, it looks like the gentleman's sword, but it's a bit more capable for military life. Also being a bit broader and beefier, it's better for parrying incoming heavier weapons that might be swung at you. However, I still don't think it's very good, largely because it's not very good at cutting overall. It's very good at thrusting, okay, but thrusting in melees on board ships, boarding actions, things like this, not perhaps the best idea. Most fencing treatises tell you to cut more than to thrust if you're surrounded by multiple opponents. But also it has a very minimal hilt really that doesn't offer an awful lot of protection. But overall it's just a very light weapon, which is great if you're in a duel, very quick, very precise. But if you're in rough and tumble melee, having a very light, relatively flimsy weapon when someone might swing something like a large chunk of wood at your head is not necessarily the best thing to be trying to parry with. So therefore, what might be slightly better than that? Well, we get into the realms then of things which are beefed up and better for cutting. Now, I actually have a sword in my collection here. This probably is of about the perfect date actually for the Golden Age of Piracy, which might be a fantastic candidate. You'll notice that the hilt, if I just grab the small sword again for a second, the hilt is like a massively beefed up and scaled up small sword hilt. So you've got a lot more hand protection, it's a lot more robust. But look at the blade is a broadsword. So this kind of blade, usually made in Solingen, some of them were made in Italy and Spain, but lots of them made in Germany, in Solingen in Germany, and exported. These were often fitted to things like Highland basket-hilted swords and things like this, so proper, and cavalry swords, so proper military cut and thrust swords with a decent amount of cutting capacity, very good cutting capacity in fact, and this is double-edged as well. And double-edged swords have certain advantages in close because you can cut with the back edge, you've got more angles of attack. If someone grapples or grabs your blade, it's easier to deal with if you've got edges. So lots of advantages. So this is a really good all-purpose cut and thrust sword. And you still have the aesthetic, if you're the fancy officer and you want to look like the gentleman, you've still got the aesthetic of a small sword, of a gentleman's sword, but with a blade which is now more suited to military life. Now we're going to continue down this thought process of cut and thrust swords for a minute, but before we do, a very quick word about our amazing sponsors for this video, who are War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and it's available now for free on PC, consoles and mobile devices. You can play War Thunder on the land, at the sea or in the air, and I am actually a War Thunder player myself. I have to admit I'm a bit of a tank guy. One of my favourite things about the game is there's no simple hit boxes or energy bar or anything like that. It actually has one of the most sophisticated damage models of any game out there. And in fact there's even an X-ray view, so when you hit an enemy vehicle or you get hit, it shows where the damage has gone through the vehicle and what's been taken out. You can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships of 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armoured cars of the 1920s right through to fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder, where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. Join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today and delve into the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there's simply no game better suited for fans of military history. Now, you've been able to play War Thunder for free on your PC or console for a while, but there's a new mobile device version available now. The all-new mobile version of War Thunder is available on iOS and Android, allowing you to take the battlefield wherever you go. One of the things I love the most about War Thunder and playing it on a regular basis is that it's got these three gaming modes: arcade, simulator, and then in between the kind of realism modes. So you can essentially choose how you want to play at a given moment. If you want to have a quick, easy game, you can go for the arcade mode. If you want to go in deep with all of the nitty-gritty details, you go full simulator. So you can try out War Thunder right now for absolutely free. And the game's available on PC, Xbox and PlayStation, or mobile. So you can sign up and get playing right now using the links down below, in the video description and also in the pinned comment. And if you're either a new player or you're returning and you haven't played for the last 6 months, then on PC and console there's also a massive bonus pack if you sign up using those links. And that bonus pack includes the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions and 7 days of premium account access. And that's available only for a limited time, so get clicking now. Right, thanks for sticking with me. Now back to the video. So here we've got a hilt which is a bit like a scaled up small sword, but with a cut and thrust blade. If we, however, moved away from the idea of having a small sword shaped hilt and we went for something a bit more protective, then we get into the realms of things like this. So this again dates to this kind of period. It's late 1600s, so this is Golden Age of Piracy. But look at that blade. That is a double-edged cut and thrust blade of the likes that you might find on a medieval arming sword, a knight's sword, but with more hand protection. So we've got a front knuckle bow, we've got a side bow, we've got a bar linking those, we've got a double shell guard. This has got a thumb ring, which I'll talk about in a future video. So this has got quite a lot of hand protection and a good cut and thrust blade. A more common form of sword, which more of you might be more familiar with, is the basket hilt. So we could move into the realms of basket hilts. Now, do I think this would be good as a piratical sword? Yes, and it is something that I would be very tempted to choose. Will I choose this? I don't know. You have to stay to the end to find out. But this has got a huge amount of hand protection. Obviously, you can stab with it. It's not hugely long. This is about a 34-inch blade, so this is something you can use on foot or on horse. And it's not crazy long for using on ship. It's not as long as a rapier. It's perhaps a little bit long for shipbound combat. That your mileage might vary on that, but this one isn't double-edged, this one's single-edged, so this is what's called a back sword, because it's blunt on the back, it's got a sharp front edge, or it was a sharp front edge when it was new in the middle of the early 1700s. So this is a basket hilt, huge amount of hand protection, so primarily that's there for hand protection, but of course if someone does come in close and you're in close in range, it turns into a device for punching with as well. So you're not only is your hand very, very protected, but obviously you can hit with the pommel, which you can do pretty much any sword, but you can also punch with the front of the guard as well. And you've got a good edge and you've got a good point. So this is a really good option. This is bigger and more cumbersome to carry, and we're going to come back to that point in a second. So far we've only looked at European swords, but as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there are other options available to us, depending on where you are and depending on where you're from, what your culture is, where your fleet is operating and things like that. So for example, if we were a Japanese pirate, it is extremely likely that we would be serving with that we would come aboard with either a katana or a wakizashi. Now, you might think, oh, a katana's far too long to use on board ship. Well, let's face it, Japanese pirates were famous and they used katana. So we know that katana were popularly used by pirates, particularly by Japanese pirates and probably by others as well. And in fact, the Chinese actually had problems with Japanese pirates, and the Chinese actually emulated Japanese swords so much that a whole family of Chinese swords evolved for fighting Japanese pirates and inspired by Japanese swords. So if we have a katana, you might think of that as a long sword, but actually, for those of you who don't know, katana aren't actually very long. So most katana tend to have, if I use imperial measurements, please forgive me, but most katana tend to have between about 26 and 29 inch blades. That's fairly short. That is actually comparable with what we would describe in Europe as a short sword. Here we go. So that is about a 28 inch blade there. So short swords have blades of equal reach and length to a katana. Yes, the grip's longer. We'll come to that in a second. But even, you know, even something like this, which is a true short sword, is only a tiny bit shorter than the katana. So in fact, in terms of operating on board a ship in confined conditions, a katana actually doesn't have an overly long blade. It's not going to get that much in the way of things. The hilt possibly will. But it's only really a problem in wearing, and that is because when you've got the katana in its saya or scabbard and you're wearing it, you do have quite a lot of hilt sticking out here, and this could be, and probably was, a problem sometimes in getting tangled up with things. However, having a long grip here means it's quicker and easier to access, as demonstrated in Iaido, and you've got a lot of grip to immediately grab onto. However, you have practically no hand protection. You've got a small suba or guard there, so you don't have much hand protection at all. However, what is the katana good at? Cutting. Everybody agrees katana are supreme cutters, and if you are gripping it two-handed, you've got a huge amount of leverage and control and acceleration on the sword. So I think a katana is a pretty good choice. Would I choose it? Possibly. Some of you might be thinking, well, why not, for confined spaces, choose the wakizashi? And in fact, that's probably actually what a lot of Japanese, and well, we know a lot of Japanese did in confined spaces. They actually went for the wakizashi rather than the katana, or uchi katana, because it's smaller. Okay, so this is bigger than a knife, but it's a short sword, and it doesn't have a long grip usually. Some of them do, but most of them don't have particularly long grips. So it's easier to wear, easier to draw quickly, and very, very potent cutter still, but more compact. But you might not be Japanese. You might not have access to Japanese weapons. You might be from the Philippines, and that's where something like the kris could be an option. And again, it's basically a short sword, isn't it? Now, it has very little hand protection because these were designed to be used with shields originally, but it is a phenomenal cutter, really, really good cutter. Not particularly good at thrusting, because it's really designed to be thrust against people who are not wearing much clothing and certainly no armour. So against people wearing heavier clothing or layers of clothing, that's probably not going to be a very good thrusting point, but it is a supreme, supreme cutter, and the Filipino martial artists certainly know what they're doing with things like the kris or the barong or other large knives. So, and again, they provided a lot of pirates in this part of the world. So absolutely, a lot of Filipino weapons would have ended up, and other Southeast Asian weapons would have ended up in hands of pirates. And here we've got some other examples. So I'll go two for one with this. So essentially, we've got various forms of parang, barong, and various other types of chopping implements. Some of them are more pointed than others, and this one is actually edged on the forwards curve, so that's more of a hacking blade. This is more of a slashing blade because the edge is on the front curve here. So one curves forward, one curves backwards. This one's got a clipped point, so it's better for thrusting, but you'll notice, and this is very common with things except for the parang nabur, which is later, very common with lots of Southeast Asian edged weapons, is they don't have much hand protection, and that's largely because they are intended to be used with shields. Okay, and having a shield negates some of the need for having hand protection, but also it's just simply an evolution thing. If they haven't evolved hand protection on their weapons, they don't have them. Just the same as earlier, Iron Age swords don't have much hand protection on them. So these weapons have supreme cutting ability. Some of them have good thrusting ability. They don't have much hand protection, but they are good sizes. Now you'll notice, I'll just hold this for a second, that blade is extremely similar really functionally in size and shape and capabilities to a European cutlass. Actually, when we pick up the 18th century European cutlass or hanger here, the blades are actually functionally very similar, even if the hilts are different designs, and they were made by completely different cultures at similar time, but different cultures, different parts of the world. Similar end result. And, you know, again, if I pick up another hanger, again, so this one's longer, but, you know, similar kind of end result. If we even compare with the Moro Chris, they might look very different, but they're about the same size and they do a similar thing. Now, looking completely different, and you might not associate these two things at all, if we just go to the wakizashi for a second, again, they can both do the same thing. They can both cut and thrust, and they're not hugely different in size and design. So are we starting to notice a trend here, a tendency? I think we might be. But before we do that, I think we need to mention other weapons just for a second. So some people, undoubtedly at this time, would have preferred to use a hatchet. This is a nice replica from Ravensbeak Forge, incidentally. And others would have used a dirk or a knife. Now, these were really good weapons for specific reasons on board ships. So one of them is that there are things you want to do which aren't fighting when you're a pirate. One of those things could be cutting rigging, for example. Say you've been in a storm and a master's broken and the rigging's hanging off the side of the ship, and so axes were super useful. The other thing, and I've talked about boarding axes in previous videos, is when you're climbing up ships, these can actually be used as climbing aids. So the spike on the back can be rammed in. You can do it with the blade as well, but you can ram that into the side of the thing, and if you've got multiple of them, you can essentially make climbing points up the side of ships. So axes are very useful in ways that swords aren't really, or at least not easily. And knives, of course, can be everywhere. So with all of these swords we're looking at, I want you to remember that knives and axes and even boarding pikes are very important weapons. Obviously firearms as well, but we're leaving them aside for now. So knives will be everywhere. So just because you've got a sword doesn't mean you can't also have a knife. Just because you've got a sword doesn't mean you won't also have a boarding axe. So I want to give an honourable mention to these. So, having looked at all of these swords, what would I choose? I think you can probably tell that for piratical exploits, I personally would not choose a small sword or a thrust-centric rapier. They are very specialised tools for duelling on foot, but I do not think that they're well adapted due to their size, their length, their lack of cutting ability, their hand protection, all of these things that we talked about. I don't think they're very well suited to piratical exploits. I think something which is an evolution of the small sword, in other words, the shearing sword or narrow broadsword like this, the spadroon essentially, could be a fairly good option. I wouldn't cry into my cereal if I had to have one of these when I was a pirate in the late 17th century. I actually think that would be a pretty good choice. It's got good reach, it's got pretty good point control. So if I do come into single combat against another person, if I'm an officer, for example, a captain, and this was known to be done, and I come into combat, essentially a duel with another captain on board ship, this is a sword which offers a lot of advantages of reach and point control, and it's still got the ability to cut and fight against people using cutlasses all around as well. But I would also say that of the various forms of basket-hilted broadsword and backsword. And speaking completely, perfectly honestly, for me personally, I would rather have a basket hilt than the previous weapon, a spadroon type weapon that we looked at before, because this has greater cutting potential, it's got greater hand protection, it's got just as good reach. It might not be as good at thrusting, but I think in the rough and tumble combat on the high seas, a basket hilt would actually be a pretty damn good choice. And what about the things like the hanger and cutoe? Well, I have to be honest, I think these are fantastic weapons for your typical sailor. So if you're a typical sailor, the reason these are so good is because they're very good at hacking, which is what most relatively untrained fencers do. Most people naturally want to just hit. But also they're incredibly convenient to wear. So if your primary job is operating guns or using a boarding pike, or doing the sails and the masks and the rigging and all of these kind of normal jobs that sailors actually have to do to make a ship work, then having a weapon like this that's small and easier to wear, and you can climb up and down things more easily, and if you're fighting below decks, it's more confined and easier to maneuver in confined spaces. This is great. So, and if for example I was from Southeast Asia rather than from Europe, then I would choose the equivalent. And I put these things, whether it's a wakizashi or a form of barong or parang or a hanger or a cutlass, basically all in the same category. So I would say if I was a normal enlisted man, if I was a sailor, if I was the typical, working class pirate, then a weapon like this undoubtedly would be the best choice. And it's what they chose. Surprise, surprise. Those are exactly the weapons they did choose. If I was higher ranking and I didn't have to do so much of the manual labour, personally, what would I choose? Probably a basket-hilt broadsword or backsword, because it's got the best reach, still amazing cutting potential equal to a cutlass, better hand protection, so I think that's the absolute best. So there we go. As always, it all depends on the context. So any form of short, choppy, machete, barong, parang, cutlass type option for a typical pirate sailor is what I would choose if that was my job. If my job was to do a little bit less of the work and a little bit more of the commanding, I personally would choose a basket hilt of various sorts, or possibly even the Spanish cup-hilted broadsword, the Bilbo, which we've looked at in a few videos recently. So once again, I want to thank and recommend War Thunder. Check out those links down below. I am actually a War Thunder player. I highly recommend it. I've got to admit, I enjoy the tanks the most, but you check it out and find out what you enjoy. And thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. So as always, I have been Matt Easton. I will hopefully continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel again for another video. Any particular video requests or recommendations, always welcome in the comments down below. Thanks a lot for watching, and take care of yourselves. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.